The moment you go silent, something inside them jolts, not because you vanished, but because the version of you they controlled just slipped out of their hands. I want you to listen closely, because what I'm about to explain isn't about manipulation, revenge, or games. It's about human psychology, attachment, and what actually happens in the mind when a man who was always available suddenly isn't. I'm speaking to you as a psychologist, but also as someone who has watched this exact pattern play out thousands of times, quietly, predictably, and painfully. When you disappear without drama, without explanations, without begging, the first thing they feel is confusion. Real confusion. Their brain had a model of you, a predictable pattern. You replied, you showed up, you tried to fix things. And when that pattern breaks, the mind panics, not loudly, but internally. Confusion is uncomfortable because it removes certainty, and certainty is what keeps emotional power stable. Then comes the second feeling, loss of control. Not loss of you, loss of control over you. And that distinction matters more than most men realize. Control isn't always intentional or malicious. Sometimes it's subtle. Knowing you'll be there, knowing you'll respond, knowing they don't have to worry about losing you. When you disappear, that safety net collapses, and the mind doesn't ask, why did he leave? It asks, why didn't I see this coming? The third thing they feel is a sudden spike in self-questioning. Even confident people experience this. Your absence forces reflection because there's no longer a constant signal reassuring them of their value in your eyes. Silence creates a mirror, and in that mirror they start replaying moments they dismissed. Things they said, things they didn't say. The mind hates unfinished emotional loops, and your disappearance opens one they can't close. Next comes emotional recalibration. This is where it gets uncomfortable for them. When you were present, your value was familiar. Familiar things feel smaller even when they're important. When you vanish, your value is reprocessed through absence. And absence has a way of amplifying what presence diluted. The brain assigns more weight to what it can no longer access easily. That's not romance. That's neuroscience. Then they feel something quieter, but deeper. Vulnerability. Your silence removes feedback. They don't know where they stand anymore. And not knowing where you stand triggers insecurity, even in people who rarely admit it. The mind starts scanning for threats, and suddenly, the idea of losing you becomes real. Not hypothetical, not distant, but immediate. Another feeling follows closely behind. Curiosity mixed with anxiety. They begin wondering what changed. Not in you, but in the dynamic. Are you done? Are you stronger? Did you finally choose yourself? And here's the part most men miss. When you disappear calmly, without punishment or explanation, it suggests emotional strength. And strength is magnetic because it signals boundaries. Then comes comparison. They start measuring others against you, not because you were perfect, but because you were familiar and emotionally anchored. Your absence creates a reference point, and once the mind establishes a reference point, it keeps returning to it. Finally, there's respect. Not always conscious, not always immediate, but real. Disappearing without hostility communicates something powerful. You don't need to chase to prove worth. And that rewires how they see you, from someone seeking validation to someone who values himself. This is not about hurting someone, it's about what happens when you stop abandoning yourself to stay connected. And the psychology of that shift is far more intense than most people are prepared for. After the initial shock settles, something more complex begins to form beneath the surface. This is where emotions stop being reactive and start becoming revealing. The disappearance doesn't just change how they feel about you, it changes how they feel about themselves in relation to you. And that shift is far more destabilizing than anger or sadness. One of the strongest emotions that emerges is doubt. Not doubt about you, but doubt about their assumptions. They assumed you'd stay. They assumed access to you was guaranteed. They assumed time was on their side. Your silence quietly dismantles those assumptions without saying a word. And when assumptions collapse, the mind has to rebuild its understanding of reality. Then comes emotional imbalance. Human beings unconsciously regulate their emotions through others. When you were present, you played a role in their emotional ecosystem: support, attention, validation, familiarity. When you disappear, that regulation is disrupted. They feel off, unsettled, slightly disoriented, and they often don't immediately know why. That discomfort gets associated with your absence, which increases your psychological presence in their mind. Another feeling that surfaces is guilt, even if they won't admit it. Guilt isn't always about wrongdoing, it's about missed opportunity. The mind starts asking quiet questions late at night. Did I take him for granted? Did I push too far? Did I assume too much? And guilt has a strange effect. It keeps someone emotionally connected even when they're physically distant. Soon after, defensiveness may appear. They may tell themselves stories to regain emotional balance. He's just busy. He'll come back. This doesn't mean anything. These narratives aren't about truth. They're about soothing discomfort. When someone needs to explain your absence to themselves, it means your absence has power. Then there's a deeper emotion most people don't talk about: fear of replacement. When you disappear without explanation, the mind fills the silence with possibilities. Not dramatic ones at first, just enough to spark unease. The idea that you may have moved on, grown, or chosen differently creates emotional competition where none existed before. And competition heightens perceived value. Another feeling follows quietly: nostalgia. Not just missing you, but missing how they felt around you. Nostalgia is selective. It highlights warmth and minimizes conflict. Your absence triggers memory reconstruction, where positive moments are replayed more vividly than negative ones. This isn't intentional, it's how the brain copes with loss of emotional access. Then comes emotional curiosity. They begin wanting to know what you're thinking, what you're feeling, whether you've changed. Curiosity keeps the mind engaged, looping back to you repeatedly throughout the day. And every time curiosity goes unanswered, emotional tension increases. At some point, they feel a subtle shift in power dynamics. Not because you're doing anything, but because power often belongs to the person least afraid to walk away. Your disappearance signals emotional independence. And independence changes how people evaluate connection. Suddenly, you're not just someone who wanted them, you're someone who chose themselves. Another emotion emerges here: admiration mixed with discomfort. It's uncomfortable to realize someone you thought you had figured out is capable of quiet strength. That realization challenges ego. And ego doesn't like being challenged. Finally, they feel uncertainty about the future of the connection. And uncertainty is where attachment either dissolves or deepens. When certainty is removed, emotional investment becomes conscious instead of automatic. They start noticing what your presence added to their life because it's no longer there to be ignored. This stage isn't loud, it doesn't look dramatic, but internally it's intense because silence doesn't just remove communication, it forces awareness. And awareness changes everything. As time passes, the emotions shift again, this time from internal confusion to emotional reckoning. This is the phase where feelings stop floating in the background and begin demanding resolution. Your absence becomes something they can't ignore, and the mind starts searching for meaning instead of comfort. One of the strongest emotions here is longing. Not the dramatic kind shown in movies, but a quiet, persistent pull. Longing appears when something meaningful is no longer accessible. It's the emotional echo of connection. They may find themselves reaching for their phone without thinking, or expecting your name to appear in places it no longer does. These moments are brief but frequent, and they accumulate. Then comes emotional regret. Regret is different from guilt. Guilt says, I may have done something wrong. Regret says, I didn't appreciate something while I had it. This is where memory sharpens. Moments where you showed care, patience, or presence are reinterpreted with new weight. Regret isn't about wanting the past back. It's about realizing the past mattered more than they admitted. Another feeling that emerges is emotional exposure. Without your presence, there's no buffer. They feel more alone in their thoughts. And that loneliness isn't always about missing you. It's about missing how you made emotional space feel safer. When someone contributes to emotional stability and then disappears, the absence is felt most during moments of vulnerability. Then there's identity disruption. This one is subtle but powerful. Relationships, even casual ones, become part of how people define themselves. When you disappear, a piece of that identity is suddenly gone. The mind has to ask, who am I in this dynamic now? And questions of identity tend to linger. Another emotion follows: respect mixed with distance. They begin to see you differently, not as someone waiting, but as someone who chose movement over stagnation. That shift creates distance, but also admiration. and admiration keeps emotional doors open longer than attachment alone. They may also feel frustration at themselves, at the situation, at the silence. Frustration often masks deeper emotions. It's easier to feel irritated than exposed, but underneath frustration is usually desire for clarity, and clarity requires engagement, something your absence denies. Then comes reflection on effort. They begin measuring how much energy they gave versus how much you gave. This comparison wasn't visible when you were present. Your disappearance creates contrast, and contrast is what makes imbalance obvious. Another feeling emerges quietly: accountability. Even if it's never spoken, they may begin recognizing where they avoided emotional responsibility, where they delayed decisions, where they assumed time would always smooth things over. Your silence removes that illusion. At some point, hope appears, but it's cautious. Hope that there's still a chance. Hope that things aren't finished. Hope that you're still reachable. Hope doesn't always mean action, but it keeps emotional investment alive. Finally, they feel the weight of consequence. Not punishment, consequence. The understanding that choices, even passive ones, shape outcomes. Your disappearance becomes a boundary drawn without words, and boundaries redefine relationships more than explanations ever could. This phase is where emotions mature, where the mind stops resisting and starts accepting that something has changed. And once acceptance begins, nothing ever returns to how it was before. This is the final shift, the one most people never talk about because it's the one that changes how they carry you forward in their life, whether you ever return or not. By now, your disappearance is no longer an event. It's a reality, and reality forces meaning. One of the first emotions that settles in is acceptance. Not peace, acceptance. Acceptance doesn't mean they're okay with it. It means their mind has stopped fighting the truth that access to you is no longer guaranteed. And once access is no longer guaranteed, value becomes conscious. People protect what feels scarce, not what feels endless. Then comes reevaluation. They begin reassessing the entire dynamic with clearer eyes, not through emotion alone, but through logic. They start asking questions they avoided before. What did he actually bring into my life? How did I feel when he was around? What changed after he left? This reevaluation is dangerous, in a quiet way, because it strips away excuses. Another feeling follows. Emotional respect solidifies. Earlier, respect may have been mixed with discomfort. Now it becomes clearer. They recognize that disappearing without cruelty required discipline, that not chasing required strength, that walking away without burning bridges required self-worth, and self-worth leaves a deeper imprint than neediness ever could. Then there's a subtle emotional shift toward attraction, not always romantic, but psychological. The human mind is drawn to people who choose themselves without demanding validation. Your absence communicates self-alignment. And alignment is attractive because it signals emotional maturity. They may also feel a sense of misalignment, the realization that timing, effort, or emotional readiness didn't match. This isn't sadness, it's recognition. Recognition that something meaningful didn't fail because it was weak, but because it wasn't honored in time. Another emotion emerges: restraint. If they consider reaching out, they hesitate, not because they don't want to, but because your disappearance taught them something. That access to you now requires intention, and intention feels heavier than impulse. Then comes comparison again, but this time sharper. Others are no longer compared to who you were, but to how you made them feel about themselves. Safe, seen, challenged. And that standard is difficult to replace once established. At this stage, they also feel a quiet form of accountability. Not dramatic remorse, just the understanding that emotional outcomes are shaped by choices, not luck. That realization lingers far longer than regret. Finally, they feel closure forming, not because answers were given, but because boundaries were respected. Closure doesn't always come from conversation. Sometimes it comes from behavior that makes the truth undeniable. Your silence became a statement. Whether they reach out or not, you've already changed the narrative. You shifted from someone waiting to someone moving forward, and that shift lives in their mind long after the silence ends. So here's the question I want you to answer honestly, in the comments, not just to yourself. If you disappeared today, would it be an act of escape or an act of self-respect? Write your answer below. If this spoke to something you felt but couldn't explain, like the video. Subscribe if you want deeper psychological truths most people never hear. And share this with one friend who needs to stop chasing and start choosing himself.